Welcome to part 3 of my debunking of Dr. Simone Gold, the founder of America's Frontline Doctors. In this series, we've seen Simone Gold spout misinformation and lies about COVID vaccines and hydroxychloroquine. But in this third part, she's going to talk about her views on how COVID-19 affects people of color. This is the part of her talk that really upset me the most, and it was actually really hard for me to watch this part of her talk, because from my view, she is someone who is pretending to be an advocate for minorities and people of color, while completely not understanding the history of people of color. And as a result, she ends up giving advice that works directly against the betterment of people of color. So let's hear what she has to say, and I'll explain why she is getting it completely wrong.
I gave this talk only once before, about 2 weeks ago, and I approached the Black community. I'd like to just talk straight and openly. I was well aware as a physician that African Americans and other Black and brown minority persons had a natural antipathy towards vaccines. And I wanted to give them the science behind it, so I ended up digging deeply into that issue.
Now, it is completely understandable that people of color might have some antipathy towards things like vaccines. Simone Gold goes on to mention the Tuskegee experiments, which is a good example. Unfortunately, it is not the only example. There are several examples throughout history of medical establishments and science in general being outright racist and destructive against people of color. There are more well-known stories, such as the Henrietta Lacks story, but there are also less talked about examples, such as the fact that geneticists during the time of slavery said that Black people were fundamentally different from white people to the extent that they can't feel pain. So I get it. I get being suspicious. I get having that antipathy. However, here's what I would say to that. It was always scientists who were saying those terribly wrong things. It was always scientists who were doing those horrible acts. It was never supported by data. The data never said that Black people were fundamentally different from white people in the ways that those geneticists back then claimed. That's why it is so important to be able to look at and understand data. Data tell you the truth, not any one scientist. Knowledge really is power. I'm no leading authority, I'm no world expert on the pandemic, but I know how to look at and understand data. And when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines and all vaccines, following the data and making sure that it is consistent across scientists from all over the world is the best you can do. So if you want to prevent the next Tuskegee experiment, follow the data. And right now, the data say that people of color stand to gain a lot from getting this COVID vaccine. But Simone doesn't really think so. And I have a problem with that.
So let me give you some examples of where vaccines have gone wrong for Black and brown people. So with the rubella vaccine, race and ethnicity were shown to affect the antibody responses like at a higher level than compared to Europeans.
No, absolutely not. The rubella vaccine has been shown to be effective regardless of race. If anything, people of African descent were shown to have a slightly more robust immune response. She's really just making all this up. And she goes on to say the same thing about several other vaccines, all of which are also false.
And the hepatitis vaccine also had this similar different response amongst races. Specifically, white boys were 64% less likely to have autism diagnosis relative to non-white boys when they gave the hepatitis vaccine to babies.
Is she seriously suggesting that hepatitis B vaccines cause autism more often in people of color than white people? Where does she get off with this? Seriously, there is no evidence to support such a connection. The only papers that you'll find making such a claim were published by a doctor who had his medical license revoked for questionable treatments of children with autism. His papers have been thoroughly discredited, and I'll provide that link to you in the description below.
Now, why is this important? Because when you read the language that the government is putting out about how to prioritize the vaccine, the experimental biological agent, they are making an overt and covert attempt to push this heavily on blacks and browns.
Is she not aware that minorities and people of color Is she not aware that minorities and people of color are being disproportionately affected by the pandemic?
Here's what I want to say to that. It's true that there are many areas where black people were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So an example I like to use was in New Orleans, Louisiana, where blacks made up 31% of the population, but they made up 70% of the people admitted to the hospital with COVID-19.
Ah, okay, she is aware of it. So what's the problem?
So on the left, they were saying this was because of racism. But when you look at the data, there does not yet appear, and I think never will appear, to be an independent risk factor.
It sounds like she doesn't get it. I don't think she gets it.
Second is in areas of the world where people have those high individual risk factors like diabetes or obesity and other illnesses, and the group risk factors such as living and working in tight quarters, it's not black people that get it at a worse rate, it's those people in those situations. So in Louisiana, it was black people, but in the UK, it was Middle Eastern and East Asian.
She doesn't get it. She's so close to getting it, and yet so far away. Simone, what on earth do you think is the reason that people of color are more likely to have risk factors and live and work in close quarters? It's a long history of institutional racism. It is this long history of racial injustice which are the reasons why people of color are more likely to live in impoverished areas where overall health is poorer. It is why people of color are more likely to work frontline jobs. It is why they deserve a COVID-19 vaccine priority. This is what Simone is not getting. It is not the biological race that makes you more susceptible to severe COVID. It is the long history of societal and cultural racial injustices that make people more susceptible to severe COVID.
How is it that people want to sign up for this system on an experimental, and how is giving it to black people fair racial justice? I don't know. Maybe someone smarter than me can figure that out.
I just did, Simone. And if you honestly want to be an advocate for people of color, understand our history first.
And I feel very offended on this because, the people who they're going to target first, honestly, are my friends, which are all the black nurses that I work with in the ERs, because I've spent my whole career in the inner city. And so they're all being told, you got to line up, you got to take this. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you're about 45 years old, 50 years old, you're in good health, you're working every day. Why should you be prioritized? There's no actual increased risk to the healthcare worker.
Wait, hold on. She actually just said that there is no increased risk to catching COVID for healthcare workers who treat COVID patients. Is she listening to herself?
And of course, the irony of saying that this is really a racial problem is looking at the continent of Africa. For those of you who don't know it, the one continent that's been spared is Africa, except South Africa, but the rest of Africa.
Her point here is moot because she still doesn't get it. It's not biological race, it's societal and cultural racism that puts people of color in situations that have made them more susceptible to severe COVID. With that said, it does seem that the African continent has mostly avoided the worst of the pandemic, but I'll link an article in the description that gives a little more nuance and context to that topic.
Phrase this as a human rights issue. This is not anti-vaccination. I'm always reminded, please tell people where I stand on the vaccine issue. I personally have been vaccinated for everything. I personally made sure my kids have been vaccinated for everything. This is a human rights issue that we cannot mandate. Human beings take experimental agents.
Weird that she gives a whole talk of anti-vaccine misinformation and then tries to distance herself from the anti-vax title by saying that she vaccinated herself and her kids. Well, spreading anti-vax misinformation, unfortunately, still makes you an anti-vaxxer, Simone, at least in my book. Well, I think that is more than enough of Simone Gold for now. That is her whole video debunked. If you made it to this part 3, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I do think that fighting COVID-19 misinformation is more important than ever now that we have vaccines available. So I do hope you found the information in these videos to be helpful in your life and any discussions you might have with anybody who has any vaccine hesitancy. Once again, the links to all the information and science that I talk about in these videos are in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe so you can join me next week where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.